Hey, everybody, it's Scott Licky from Democracy Tomorrow. Today we have a special guest, Chris Blyth, who is just back from an extraordinary adventure, which he will tell you all about. Chris has worked in all sorts of different institutional contexts, particularly in the corporate sector, and uh, has undergone a number of personal transformations over the years, leading him into directions which most people involved in the corporate sector can only dream of. So, without any further ado, Chris, welcome to Democracy Tomorrow. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. We're good mates for the last 20 years or so, and it's always a pleasure talking with you.
So, maybe start by telling us, where you were brought up and, the values you were
Sure,
raised
sure,
with and,
sure.
and where you started working and how
Yeah.
it evolved from there.
So my childhood was in Johannesburg, growing up in the apartheid era. And when I was around about 14 years old, we moved out of South Africa to New Zealand, and I finished my high school there and university and so forth, and got a job in the corporate world, working for a multinational for about 5 years. Then joined one of the global banks for about 14 years, and then set up my own advisory business, which I've been doing ever since, along with a bunch of other stuff in recent times. So I think it's probably fair to say it's a colourful history with lots of different cultures and dimensions involved in it, and happy to share some stories as we go along.
So are you like permanently stuck in the southern hemisphere or are you going to eventually go north?
Yes, no, I did try the Northern Hemisphere and it's not for me. I did go to London thinking that would be a good place to be a banker, and it is a good place to be a banker. The only problem is the sun gets up at around 9:30, 10 in the morning, and then it disappears by 5 o'clock in the afternoon during the winter. I did one of those, and I realized that I'm southern bound.
Good choice. Good choice. So, you know, let's just start briefly with South Africa. Do you remember as a kid growing up in apartheid South Africa, which of course for viewers ended after about 80 years in 1994 officially with the release of Nelson
Yep.
Mandela and then the rise of the ANC and the new constitution and so forth. Do you remember as a child growing up there the depth of the racism that pervaded society there?
Maybe just to paint a quick picture around how does it work back in the 80s, and in the 70s in South Africa. So I was born in 1969, so I was 14 by the time we left in 1983. That was during the reign of apartheid. I went to a private school, a very nice school. It was the same school that my father had been to. It was an all-white school, bar for there were one or two black kids in the school, so it was quite progressive in that way. And they were diplomats, children, and so forth. You go there now, and I did go to one of the reunions, and that's changed completely. So it's certainly on the progressive side um, as a school. But growing up, I'm sure everyone's heard and been recounted stories of you've got a lovely house, you've got a swimming pool, you've got a tennis court, you've got someone who looks after the garden, you've got someone who's in the kitchen, your clothes magically come off the floor and go through a washing machine and turn up clean and ironed, and so you can call that a very privileged world. I think what the rationale for us leaving South Africa revolved around my parents, who were always activists, looking for ways to try and make things change, back through the university days and beyond that. We won't get it right into the politics now, but there came a day where they were frankly told, you're in the way of a conflict that needs to happen. And once that conflict happens, we can break apartheid aside. So we packed our bags and we moved to New Zealand, and that was a new experience, going to a different public school and a whole different perspective. So it was certainly a grounding for me in understanding as a kid some of these social impacts around how society works and so forth. And I think I'm carried that with me throughout my years. And our history in South Africa is very rich and deep. We were on the one side English and on the other side Norwegian, coming to South Africa in the 1800s. So there was a long history there. I still have a lot of cousins and everyone else in that community, in those communities, and talk to them regularly, and it's evolved, and there's good and there's bad, and it's an evolving situation.
Right. And do you recall as a child understanding the nature of the system, or was it just the way that it was?
I think that anybody in that society growing up like that, you have the lens and that's the life you're living in. I would say I'll recall one situation quite vividly. It's actually quite emotional. It was 1976. I think most people know that have a sense of a South African history. That was the Soweto riots. As a kid, big aeroplanes and helicopters and all that sort of stuff is pretty exciting. And I remember very vividly these helicopters flying over our house on Soweto. Okay, so I'm think of me. I'm a 7-year-old. I'm in the backyard watching these helicopters flying over and telling my mum, "Hey, how cool is that? Look at these amazing helicopters going over." My mother is with the maid, and they know what's going on, and they have to tell me what's going on. And that was not a pretty day. I think everybody knows this was the day that a whole lot of school kids were shot in Soweto. I was a 7-year-old, but I was living on the other side of town, and that's a pretty. I don't think people get that experience in everyday life in Australia. That's for sure.
No, absolutely. And it's you're not alone in experiencing the emotions that you're experiencing as a white South African. I mean, I've encountered this innumerable times. And I think it's a very important point to make. When something bad happens or someone is subjected to something bad, it doesn't just end the second the badness ends. It sticks with you forever. Whether it's a torture victim or whether it's a violent eviction or whether it's, being subjected to an act of racism, whatever the case may be, domestic violence, it doesn't just end the second the violence stops. It sticks with people for sometimes decades. And that's about the best argument ever for not doing the bad thing in the first place, right? Things don't just go away because the situation changes. And the same is very much true generically with South Africa today. I mean, South Africa has been a free democratic country for 31 years now. And the government, as progressive as it may be in its policies, is having great difficulty delivering on the promises that the Constitution, the post-apartheid non-racial constitution, has promised. I think they're trying their best in many respects, but the fundamental situation on the ground is not changed nearly rapidly enough. And now, oddly enough, in the world in which we are mired with genocide occurring before our very eyes, conflict after conflict raging, the Trump administration in the United States of America has completely shut off the asylum avenue for all victims of human rights violations across the world, except for one group,
Yeah.
of which you are a member.
I wasn't Afrikaner, but at the same time, I fully understand what you're saying. I think just reflecting on these personal experiences, I did go to my school reunion in Johannesburg a few years ago, and one of the key reasons for leaving South Africa, being one of four boys in my family, is that there was armed services was compulsory. I had a very enlightening evening with some of my ex school friends, where those who had been to the armed forces and had been on the borders and in the townships had experienced atrocities that unfortunately some of them were actually a part of, and that has left a indelible mark in their well-being, frankly. Their ability to sleep freely every night without thinking about it, and they were pretty open and honest with me, which you know made me thank my lucky stars that my parents had the foresight to get us out of harm's way in that respect.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I don't know if this is true or not, but we used to always hear, because, I was part of the anti-apartheid movement, of course. As soon as I could be politically active, we all knew about apartheid, and I did whatever I could from the other side of the world. And all sorts of different countries. But when we saw white South Africans leaving, right, there was a sentiment that they were all going to New Zealand because the accent was at the closest they could get to the South African accent. Is that actually true?
So when we left, we were part of what they called the chicken run. The chicken run in South Africa was a period of time where the levels of violence and everything else was getting to a point. In Kuntu Wisizwe is the Zulu word for the night of the long knives, and there was a sense that a night could come where people's domestic servants might actually turn up in your bedroom and with the long knives, and so it became called the chicken run. I think that we were in that period of leaving South Africa, but quite frankly, with a very different objective. It wasn't running from the fear of that event, potential event, which never happened, but it was much more one of realizing that we couldn't be a part of a system that we couldn't change, and we couldn't actually end up making a difference. Now, that's not to be judgmental on other people who did stay, and some of them have done some amazing work, and many of my cousins and relatives continue to do so. But it was our way of dealing with that situation.
No, absolutely. And I mean, you have that, of course, in many countries where the oppressive regime is just no longer something normal people are
Mm.
willing to live under, and so they leave. They might not leave because they are facing oppression themselves, but they leave because they can't stand the oppression that's being meted out against their friends and neighbors who just simply happen to have different beliefs or maybe different skin color, in this
Yeah.
case. So after your youth in South Africa and then New Zealand, you went more into the sort of corporate and banking
Yes.
worlds, and you did that for about 20 years or so. And then did you start having different thoughts about those
Um,
fields as well?
Yeah, sure. So, I'll make it a little bit shorter. I think, I knew from a very early age that I wanted to get into finance and banking and so forth, and that was always my goal. I did a degree in economics and finance, and then sort of left field, I ended up working for a multinational for about 5 years, but heavily involved in their M&A activity offshore, and I travelled, and that was a fantastic experience to sort of learn the corporate world. And then I was lucky enough to get tapped on the shoulder by one of the investment banks that we were working with, and said, "Why don't you come to this side?" So going from corporate to advisory, the other side of the fence, and that actually was my goal in life, was to become a banker, and enjoyed 14 years of an amazing banking career, ultimately working in the telco, media, and technology sector. But just to maybe describe a little bit about the banking world, I mean, it's no surprise that it's a certain kind of person, typically a sort of male-oriented environment, pretty sort of alpha male type people, and wanting to, get their way on every deal that they do. It's sort of almost a game in some ways. I myself, I enjoyed sport. I do enjoy competition. I can't deny I don't enjoy that sort of hustle and bustle. I think that is something that I've inherited for whatever reason. So I do enjoy a challenge. I think as a youngster in the earlier years, I don't think you really understand when you're walking around town and you're 28 or 29 that you have this amount of influence, if you like, on what's going on well beyond your actual years. You're sitting in boardrooms and you're talking pretty serious stuff. I don't think you always even knew how serious it was, and the implications of certain, merger activities and so forth, big mining companies and the like of those sort of deals, and what they mean across the world. I do recall making a conscious decision around. We had a certain client that was in the sort of the betting and gaming sector, thinking, no, I don't think that one for me, and maybe that's a bit career limiting when someone wants to, get you on a deal team that's involving some of those industries. And that was probably in my sort of early mid 30s, and increasingly realized actually the investment banking world, you get hired as an investment banker to get the deal done. You don't get hired really, particularly in those years, for your opinions on world matters. You're transactional, and again, that's not a judgment, because there are many of my friends and bankers who do have very, very strong principles and so forth. And I think that's also mixed with others that sort of get on that sort of ride where you do want the next fancy holiday, you do want the beach house, you do want you build wants, and you also build a lifestyle. I'm probably one of those people where you build a lifestyle probably beyond what you should, and it eventually doesn't necessarily deliver you the value that you'd hope for. You think it's sort of less is more concept. You don't actually have to keep having more to fulfill what makes you happy. And so, to cut a long story short, I turned 40, and actually, Scott, that's about when we met through a mutual friend. I recall very, very vividly again sitting down with you. I thought it was going to be a one-time visit, but we ended up building a friendship and so forth. Coming to you, I've always enjoyed surfing, explaining that, can you help me? I need to get to Indonesia to build a school and go surfing at lunchtime and do some cool things. And I don't know if you recall, but you stopped me in my tracks, and you said you've now spent 20 plus years understanding business and finance and everything else, and if you can't apply those skills to the endeavors that you believe in, it's not worth it. You might play with your conscience a bit, but you're not actually changing the broader, longer term, impact you could have otherwise. And so that caused me to rethink. And then, ultimately we went to South America for 6 months. We had young kids at that stage, and gave me plenty of time to think about where to from here. And, in line with your advice, it was, okay, how can I do good in my version of good over a longer period of time, rather than a quick snap, 6 months, pay for my sins, and then move back into some other endeavor. The long story short is I did set up a small advisory business, very focused on the things I like, technology and those sort of things. And we've had a particular focus around what sort of clients and what sort of people are trying to do things that are changing the world for the better, whether that's social impact, whether that's sort of a climate impact and so forth. And frankly, not all of those commercial activities are successful, but the people you meet on the journey and the energy that those businesses, whether they're successful or not, create with consumers, and the education, makes it all worthwhile. And so, would I be a more wealthy person having sat in a global bank for the last 15 or 20 years versus what I've done? I think without question. Am I a better person, or do I have more internal wealth? I think certainly I have as a result of making those decisions.
Right on. Which raises a really, I think, poignant question in this hyper capitalist world in which we live, which is, there's never been more billionaires than there are today. There's around 3,000 across the world. I think one thing that almost every billionaire shares, and that I think almost all of the 1% of society globally, there's about 60 to 80 million millionaires now, right? In the global 1%, basically. Very few of those people have reached a satiation point where they suddenly and truly and realistically can look in the mirror and say, I have enough now. I need no more than I currently have. I would say 95, 98, 99% of them look in the mirror and say, next year has to be more. It just has to be more. There's no end. I just have to keep going. It just has to grow. And so, is there anything that can be said to those that hold so much economic power and therefore so much political power in our oligarchic driven world that can, bring them around to the point, which is, I actually have enough now. I don't need as much as I thought I needed. And freedom is much more valuable than an extra zero in my asset list.
Yep.
I would rather be free and able to dedicate my time to other pursuits that might make the world better rather than continuing to have to earn more, to have to grow. I mean, it's almost like it's inbuilt within the 1% in particular. And this is not a normal thing in human society. Throughout most of human history, there was no expectation that next year would be more than this year. It was just the same year after year, decade after decade, more or less the same. And I think that, this is one of the key problems in the world today, this incredible concentration of political and social and economic power at the top. And you know what they say, right? The top heavy structures of the world tend to start tipping over at a certain point. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll make a couple of comments. One will be around this compound growth concept, right? So I think everyone has an idea of what compound growth means. It means that each year you grow again, but from a higher base. So if you grow for 10%, the economy's bigger by 10%, and then you come back and grow it by 10%. And if you repeat that over and over again, you'll see that the numbers get very large very quickly.
Yeah, they used to call it the eighth wonder of the world, right?
And
Compound interest.
and it's a very important doctrine, if you want to call it that. But I think what happens though when human society is geared up for these eternal growth objectives of growing at these enormous rates, the stress and the pressure it puts on the environment is beyond imagination. The corporate world, you get measured by your profitability and your growth. I mean, that's a simple oversimplification, but those are the two things you're always trying to do: is how fast can I grow? And you don't necessarily have to be profitable at the outset, but at some stage you need to be profitable to get there. And so these growth objectives that companies have, particularly the mature ones, it can be insane because if you already have the market share in your industry, you should only be growing at the economy at best, because if you're growing at more than the economy, you're crushing something else, whether that's the environment, it's an adjacent competitor or somebody else. So, and in the individual's perspective, people have the same objectives. Here's my balance sheet this year. What's my balance sheet next year? Can I just keep that growth going? I would probably argue what you're arguing is that actually beyond a certain point, you don't really need it. I think the famous Gordon Gekko asked the question, how many boats do you need? You can only ski behind one of them at a time. But yet people do want these. They want one in each location, etc. And the other one I was going to comment briefly on is this concept of self-actualization. I think everybody has come across Maslow at some point in their life, if they've been to school or university. And what's at the top of that pyramid, I think is the self-actualization. I think my observation would be that point of the people I've met who I think are close to it, it's probably more an aspirational thing than most people actually ever achieve, or you might achieve it for a period of time and then you find things circle around. But I don't know that, certainly with the people I've met, that there's a correlation between money and self-actualization, right? So, I mean, the other word for that is happiness. I'm not sure that happiness is driven by wealth. I'm sure happiness is driven by wealth at the bottom end when you're living in poverty and coming out of it. But at the top end, once you've achieved a certain wealth objective, I don't think it keeps delivering. in incremental amounts. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, that it's kind of you could answer this question for 25 hours and still
You
never get
could.
to the end because it's such a huge thing. But
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly find that uh, a lot of very wealthy people tend not to be very generous, tend to be very fearful, tend to be completely unfree in terms of this relentless pursuit for more. And, when I see somebody who's truly wealthy begin to transcend the need for all of the things they thought they needed, to me, that makes me feel good. I'm very glad that they kind of got it because, obviously, it's too obvious to even say, but you can't take it with you, you know, and who's going to enjoy it when you're gone? Way maybe your family, big deal. But I mean, look what type of mentality it breeds, and whether we like it or not, the simple fact is we live on a finite planet. All 8.2 billion of us live within a finite closed system, essentially, right? So constant growth as one's ideology, obviously, it's been said a million times before, but it's the ideology of a cancer cell, right? Growth for growth's sake. And if you have growth for growth's sake within a closed system, with an incredibly fragile ecosystem, sooner or later things are going to hit the fan, and they already are. And whether it's climate change or resource extraction generally, now they're trying to mine the oceans. More than a quarter of the land surface of planet Earth, which is 28% of the entire surface of the Earth, more than 25% of it is officially classified as degraded land right now. So, and some estimates put it up to 60%. So we're destroying the very basis of life itself in order to get more. So, it all looks so innocent when you're the person earning all the money and you're just luxuriating in your boats and you're hanging out in Monaco and you're paying no taxes and so on and so forth. But there's a real cost to this, and when you look at it from the perspective of 60 to 80% of humanity essentially being poor, in other words, no ability to save anything because all money must be spent in order to survive, one paycheck away from financial oblivion, something's got to give at some point. And you don't want it to necessarily be the French Revolution situation. I was talking to a French woman a couple days ago on the channel here, and she told me afterwards, I didn't know this fact. It's an incredible fact. There were only 3,000 aristocratic families left in France following the French Revolution. And there were many more than that beforehand. And they all fled or were, you know, chopped their heads off, etc. So, you don't want to have that situation emerge, but we need to do something because we have the resources to secure a baseline for everybody. And yet we don't choose to do that. We have the resources to achieve many, many things we don't choose to do. And part of the reason for that is the, you know, insulating nature of the super ultra high net worth class, who is getting even more protected now by certain regimes throughout the world. So, I hope that more and more people in that category, begin to realize that, the non-materialist life is actually, once you reach a certain level of understanding or awareness of things, it's infinitely more pleasurable than the materialistic life, because the materialistic life is just another word for desire, It's just another word for hedonistically enjoying life to the point where you satisfy your perpetual desires. And it takes a while, but many people do realize that you can never totally satisfy all your desires because they're always temporary. And then you have to go to the next desire and the next one and the next one. So let me ask you this question, before we move on to more adventurous things that you've done lately. Basically, should the world be afraid of bankers? Because I remember during COVID in particular, it forced people to look at things they generally didn't look at. And one of the questions people ask, particularly in lockdown countries like this one, is which services can I truly not live without? Who are the truly indispensable workers in society? And guess what? Nobody said bankers. Nobody said corporate chiefs. Nobody said board members. Everybody said the rubbish men, the people that keep the streets clean, the delivery workers, the farmers, all of the real kind of working class jobs were the ones that everybody actually saw as indispensable. The ones they could do away with were the ones that are involved in the somewhat fictional world of international finance. So what do you think about that?
Uh, I would start off by saying, there's two of the longest professions that are documented are investment bankers and another certain profession, and I don't think either of those are going away anytime soon. And so the what's probably the more interesting question is to say, is investment banking evolving? Now, what I can talk to with some experience, having gone through banking in the 90s, the noughties, and so forth, is that there definitely have been some changes. I think there was a realization that with a massive gender imbalance, and actually it's more complicated than what it sounds just to fix it. I think the politicians are finding the same things. It actually takes a longer time endeavor. You have to change the environment and the culture to actually make it a safe and welcoming place for everybody to be able to work there. But there's certainly been a lot of inroads on that front, in terms of how banks recruit and so forth. And there's challenges, but there's definitely been improvement on that side. I would also say that coming back to the wealth creation and what people are doing with their money, I think I would say over the last 15 years, probably even more so over the last 5 years, there are a breed of Australian home offices that are going out of their way to help young entrepreneurs. They're going out of their way to find activities that are actually aligned to a better future, And so I'm going to put the hat on that is, we're moving in a direction. It's not probably quick enough, but we're moving in a direction where there are certainly some people who understand this. Now, there always will be those who are sort of self-serving individuals or whatever, and we've just got to deal with that. But I think that there's definitely a move in the right direction amongst some quite big home offices and investment banks to go some way. It's a bit like political regimes and apartheid and stuff. It's not a straight line, and we are in the midst of choose my words carefully, a global crisis when it comes to diversity and gender equality and so forth. I think when you're, the leader of the democratic world who has made inroads and helped this world for the last 50 or 70 years takes a left turn, there's a lot of casualty that comes out of the back of that, and that transcends through multinationals and their approaches and all that sort of stuff. So, here's hoping that this is a temporary blip. You probably have more detailed views on where that's going, but I think that the democracy run that we had since the Second World War has come to a bit of an end at the moment. I mean, for us people who are our sort of age, we've lived in some pretty halcyon years around how it's all worked, and I think there's a new challenge that's emerging. But I also have confidence in our children and their approach and engagement to making this change. In an Australian environment, we've got a new breed of politician in the independents, which is sort of in the areas where I live, in the inner metro areas. Again, I think everyone thought that might have been a blip, but it's sort of repeated in this latest election that the most of them held their seats, and that's a growing phenomena. So Australian politics, US politics is changing. We might move away, who knows, from the two-party system in Australia and get voices back to minorities. The two-party system doesn't do that very well. It looks after the majority. It's designed to look after the majority, less so the minority. And I think those are sort of the concepts that need to be developed and worked on. And the next generations need to start thinking that through.
Yeah, that's all very true. And I mean, that's part of the reason that we put together this channel, is to get people thinking about what democracy should and could look like in the future, particularly during this rather tumultuous period. And I think we all, I hope people realize that And it does sort of make sense to look at recent democratic exercises across the world, and particularly in the last few months. A very large number of those have been reactions against growing authoritarianism. And Canada is the obvious example. The Liberal Party there was, which is the Progressive Party, w- was meant to be obliterated in the upcoming election, and instead they won convincingly because of sounds from south of the border. Same thing here, same thing in the United Kingdom, same thing in a range of other European countries, same thing in Uruguay. The list goes on. So, all hope is most definitely not lost. But clearly, the system overall is under threat, and part of the purpose of this channel is to get people thinking about visions of democracy which are not exclusively nation state based, but something that go beyond that, something which allows humans who understand that all humans are essentially the same to participate as equals within a bigger planet wide political system. An idea which is by all means not new, it's thousands of years old, and for some reason we haven't been able to do it. But we also didn't have nation states forever. That's only a relatively new concept as well. It's 1648 is the year that people use. That's kind of plus or minus, but still, it's not a civilization length concept. It's a new concept, and I'm sure at the beginning of the nation state period, people had great reluctance to say, "Oh, this little area is going to be fenced in with a border around it and subject to certain rules chosen by the people living there." So on. That'll never work, and I'm sure many people think that a global system of world citizenship and a global parliament in which all of us participate using our iPhones for starters, and where policies are developed by AI, and where there's a universal basic income that everybody has access to, so on and so forth, may seem like the impossible dream, but it's only impossible if we continue to see it as impossible. And I think one of the stepping stones to reaching there is more and more people realizing, simply by exposure to people from other places, whether it's inside your own country or outside your own country, that in fact that guy who's driving your taxi just came from his slum house where his lovely partner made him a 5 egg omelet for breakfast, that he bought the eggs from the market, and so on and so forth. It's all the same in the end. There's a system of goods and services, there's people living in houses, there's people who put their clothes on. It's all the same. And it's easy to say that, but when you're exposed to it by seeing it elsewhere and by interacting with people, that sameness, that beautiful sameness, becomes more and more and more present. So that leads us to the final part of our discussion today, which is, you mentioned earlier that you went to live in Argentina during, the end phase of your corporate slash banking life. Oh, and I must say, by the way, I've never ever worked in the corporate sector except for once, right? And I did one corporate job because a friend of mine worked for the biggest oil company in the world. It was BP, right? And I was super reluctant to do the job. But then when I met with the people and they told me what they wanted me to do as a human rights guy, I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And I did it. And I have to say, I was very impressed with the seriousness with which, at least that segment of BP, the social responsibility side, engaged with me and the issue, which was them saying to me, we don't want to be involved in any projects anymore that involve the relocation or resettlement or eviction of people. And I said, that's good. Very glad to hear it, dudes. This is in the early 2000s. And I said, okay, well, do you want me to write a policy or something? And they said, yes, exactly that. So I wrote them like a 30, 40-page policy paper, or policy itself, actually, on what they should do in every single future instance of drilling. And with about 400 pages of annexes, so they couldn't escape the legal documents that supported the policy. They basically became part of the policy. And then they accepted it and they agreed. I don't know if they're still in agreement with it and if it's still company policy, but at least they took it on. So that's at least one instance that I know of because I was involved with it, where companies actually took this human side of the story seriously, you know. And I think there was a sort of golden era of this in the 90s and in the noughties, you know, the first 10 years of the 2000s. But I really have the sense that it's kind of fading away.
And just on that point, Scott, there's this doctrine of in the finance world around, who are you answerable to, right? So as a legal entity, with shareholders and so forth, are your shareholders, do they rank ahead of all your other stakeholders or not? And there's a big body of discussion around that issue, and I think there's also a lot of evidence to say that those who look after all the stakeholders ultimately deliver the superior outcome to their shareholders, and I think that it comes down to the CEO one by one to make that call. Is it your people? Is it your customers? Is it your environment? Or is it your shareholders that should rank ahead? And I think the short term view, those with the myopic view of it, sometimes put the shareholder in the front of the stack, but actually cheat the shareholder because they actually let go of what makes the company a good company and a sustainable company. And so, there's a lot of CEOs out there who do see all stakeholders, and those are the ones that shareholders should support.
Absolutely. Well, there's stakeholders, which are the people on the ground that have to suffer with big, huge, drills going into the ground, and then there's shareholders who may not necessarily overlap with the stakeholders. And it's a good thing just to point out that Australia is a very democratic society when it comes to shareholding because you're basically forced to in Australia be part of the market because of the superannuation retirement system that we have here, where it's sort of a public-private partnership between the state and the individual employer has to pay what is it now, 12.5% or 15% um, of your wage into a superannuation account, which you can't touch until you formally retire. And that money, of course, is invested in the market. So the average worker here, much more than many other countries, has a deep personal direct interest in the market performing and going up. In the United States, it's a very different story where you have, I believe, 90% of all shares held by the richest 10% of society. So it's totally skewed, excuse me, upwards, right? So that's another story. But anyway, just to make the point that um at the end point of your corporate slash banking career, you decided to go have a look around, and having been brought up in South Africa, New Zealand, then Australia, and working in London for a bit, you decided to go to Argentina to work in Buenos Aires, I think for either a human rights or social change organization. And how did that affect you, and how did that lead you on to your next phase?
Um, yeah, so when we moved to Buenos Aires for a break, I did work in a social change organization, and um, it was a really creative, innovative company that were, in hindsight, they were delivering gas into the outer metro areas from Bolivia. So from an environmental perspective, it was better than probably burning, firewood from the side of the road or using the gas bottles. Be nice if it was electrified, but this was something that was developed in the 90s, right? But the model they built was one where, the whole street would sign up to a program to dig holes and deliver gas into their homes. There was no corporate organisation or government was prepared to fund it. They stepped into the gap. They raised money from some larger donors from the US. Actually, I was involved on the fundraising effort. Back to your advice, do something that you know about. Um, but it was amazing to walk the streets with some of the people who were tapping the doors and saying, "Do you want to sign up for it? You can you continue paying the same price you pay for bottled gas for 3 to 4 years, and then after that it'll drop by to 1/7, right? So it would drop massively once you turned it on, and you'd paid off the cost of the infrastructure. So and it was linked. So you had groups of 4 or 5 people in a group. If your mate didn't pay your amount that month, your neighbour didn't pay, the other four pay. And so you're supporting each other to get it done. It's the Grameen Bank concept, but applied in a different way. Very creative. But it did shape my thinking. It did say that I probably can't hammer a nail straight, but I can run a spreadsheet. I can put a pitch together, and I should be doing that. And so when I came back, I did set up my own corporate advisory business with a purpose to do some of the deals with people who are going to make a difference. And so there was a definite shift of headspace towards things that I really believed in. We didn't entrench it in our mandate that it had to be, but when you're not in a big bank, you can make decisions. You can say to people, that's not something we do, or you can, if you don't want to be rude, you just say we're too busy right now. For example, when someone comes up with a new tech platform to take bets on sports, for example, typically I was very busy at those points in time, didn't have the capacity to help them. But I also knew confidently going into a boardroom, because we did still do some large deals, that representing my own business, I never ever felt the same gagging effect of not being able to say exactly what I wanted to say, and have the ability and luckily, the financial security to know that if I said something that offended somebody, but I believed in it and they wanted to sack me, they could. The nice thing about it is never got sacked once, have managed to say everything I wanted to say. And actually, even if people haven't agreed with what I've said around these tables, they were respectful of that view. And so to me, that actually was the important part. Was in the hindsight view is you probably can, if you're working in a global investment bank or a big corporate, you probably can say what you're going to say. Now, there might be some vindictive person who finds a way to stunt your career or move you on. But I would say that there is a huge amount of respect for people's views as long as they're articulated in a meaningful way.
Well, by the way, you mentioned gambling and betting websites there briefly. We're going to do an episode on that at some point in time because, Australia does have a lot going for it in many ways. And I've extolled the virtues of Australia's democratic system plenty on this channel. But one of the many Achilles heels of this country, in my humble opinion, is the gambling sector and the extent to which it pervades all corners of society, far more than any other country in the world, I think. And I mean, in terms of, they do advertisements for gambling during the middle of a game on which you can bet. I mean, that's just unbelievable. And the amount of people that use these scratch cards and use these things called pokey machines, which are basically slot machines. It's very, very big, multi-billion-dollar industry comprised of multi-billions of dollars of losses by those who can afford it the least.
And just a quick comment on gambling and these betting groups is that it's absolutely ingrained in the Australian psyche to have a punt, and there's no election campaign that doesn't start with somebody doing a two up, which is 2 coins and which side they land on. Where we've got to in the media industry globally is that advertising dollars, I think everyone knows, has been drawn towards social media and other places. And so our traditional media now is heavily reliant on these highly profitable businesses, these betting businesses for television, for radio and all these places. And actually, if you withdraw the advertising dollars coming from these, some of these media companies are actually going to collapse, or at least have to shed a lot of people. There's a very tough decision that politicians need to make to say it's not acceptable to have kids learning how to gamble at the age of 5, no matter what it means. But there's another problem to solve, and that is how do we get journalists, paid journalists, to print or generate real stories in Australia, because that funding pool is disappearing from these media agencies. It's a complex matter.
It's somewhat akin to the forestry industry versus those who wish to save the forests, you know. So you gotta realize that there's a lot of people whose livelihood depends on cutting down trees that might be hundreds of years old, and those have spin-off effects in the local community and local investment and so on and so forth. You can't just ignore that. Same thing with the betting industry, because it is so deeply ingrained here. I mean, it's very difficult to even impress upon people listening that how deep it is. I mean, you can bet on absolutely everything. Like everything. Like the small, when will the first tulip bulb sprout? I'm sure you could bet on that, and everything under the sun. So just really part of the psyche. A lot of it's without money, but everybody, a lot of people follow Australian rules football because they do these tipping things where they all bet on who's going to win that week and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's another thing. I've only bet one time in my life and I won, and I will never bet again. So I have a 100% record. I am not a betting gambling guy whatsoever. But anyway, so probably when you went to Argentina, you started seeing a side of human society that you might not have seen so extensively before, and that's kind of evolved as time has gone on, I am presuming. And most recently, you went on quite an adventure where you will have encountered many millions of humans, and hopefully that will have re-entrenched any thought you may have previously had about the similarities of all people everywhere. So tell us about your recent adventure.
Okay, so we would like to pride ourselves in being relatively intrepid when it comes to traveling and doing some fun things, but our trip to India probably it caps them all. So we're sitting in a 7 horsepower Tuk Tuk, an auto rickshaw, and we're self driving from one end of the country to the other through India, this subcontinent with 1.4 million people, 1.4 billion people, the largest democracy on earth, as they say. And we didn't really know what to expect. I could probably talk for an hour on this because it was an incredible experience at every level. So maybe to try and sort of touch some of the sort of the more human aspects of it was, we live in a country that's larger than India here in Australia, but you can drive on a piece of road at 130 k's an hour and not see anyone for an hour. In India, we're in a tuk tuk. Average speed was about 35 kilometers an hour. We drove 2,800 k's in a tuk tuk. Average temperature was probably 38 degrees. It got up to 45 degrees in the Rajasthan, in the Great Indian Desert. The heat's coming at you from the tarmac. It's coming at you from the top. It's blowing you away. You've got a towel a towel around your neck, and Michelle, she's pouring cold water on it. That's the air conditioning you've got. It lasts about 8 minutes and it's dry. But I probably would touch on the people. I'm sure most people who have traveled to India have probably come into a city and probably have popped across 2 or 3 different cities. The experience in regional and rural India, I found amazing. When you're in a tuk tuk, you're in it, and you're not in an air conditioned transfer car, sort of looking out the window. You're actually part of it. And when you pull up in a small little village that might only have 10 or 15 houses, and all the kids come around, they all want selfies. I mean, it's incredible, right? They haven't seen people like us turn up in a tuk tuk, we had ours all pimped up, which means painted with kangaroos and koala and all those sort of things. The kids, unbelievable. They're all speaking English. The next generation's up, not so good. So they translating conversations with their parents and talking to us and so forth. Um, I find it really hard to put in words. I think you need to go and do it yourself. You need to go into that environment. You've got to immerse yourself in it to really experience the. I think it was put to me one time. You got to live and love, is what the way it was told to me. That's what it's about. Live and love. And so when you think about that, it's about being in the moment. We were in what was called the rickshaw run. It's about 65 tuk-tuks on this run. It's not a race. It's a run. You've got 14 days to get from one end to the other. So you've got to keep your pace up. There's a lot of fun, all sorts of people. I thought we would be one of the oldest ones there. There were people, well into their 70s cruising around on these tuk-tuks. There was a quite a big majority, probably in their late 20s, early 30s. Everyone had a name. You gave your tuk-tuk a name. We were namastication, so sort of a hybrid of a vacation and namaste, living in the moment, having that time. We had the very best of India. I think I could probably rave for hours. We're in a tuk-tuk, there are buses, there's trucks, there's one stage along the motorway. There was a pylon that supports a wind turbine, 300 meters long kind of thing, on several trucks cruising along. You're in the tuk-tuk. Yeah, there's no sort of safety barriers. You drive your tuk-tuk underneath it, around it, and off you go to get past. The cows are sacred. You can be on a stretch of motorway. A cow could be sitting in the middle there. There's not a single honk, and they honk a lot. They just slowly go past the cow and they carry on their way. You can probably see it's quite animated. I mean, it's an amazing experience. I think the people were truly incredible. There was a slightly different attitude in the cities when you went through the cities, but in the regions and the rural area, it was delightful. We never felt under any threat or any security issues at any point throughout the whole 5 weeks we were there, which I have to say is different to traveling in parts of Africa and traveling in Latin America, in fact, traveling in America, in the US. I thought it was incredible. And I think, India has got its issues going on with its neighbors and so forth. So, I'm not blind to the other sort of things going on there. But in fact, when you come down to each individual, that doesn't come out, and I think probably where you were talking about before, Scott, around, the oneness of the world, and you think about those astronauts that go up into space and then they look down back on Earth. They have this thing, they call it the overview effect, which you can't see the borderlines from outer space. People are the same. So you have astronauts who are sort of might be, quite patriotic Americans, for example, come back with a whole different perspective saying, what is it with these borders? Why have we got them? What they're about? But certainly in India, you did get the sense of community. They're looking after each other. They're friendly with us. We got pulled over in our tuk-tuk probably 5 times a day by cars. Initially, we were like, well, maybe we've done something wrong. We've violated one of the road rules. But no, we get pulled over to have a conversation and, importantly, a selfie. So a selfie on, every day. I'll sort of pause there in case you got any questions, but I could probably talk for hours.
Well, I mean, most people watching this have probably never been to India, for starters. And, it's like one of those things in life, unless you've experienced it, as I have, probably, I don't know, 10 different times in my life, I've been to India at least. you can't explain it because it is so intense. It is so different than what you imagine. And it's different in bad ways, but it's particularly different in good ways. So there is a level of intensity and overcrowding and heat and smell and animals and illness and so many other things, and deprivation and poverty, that you can't imagine. But at the same time, the level of, you know, inquisitiveness, curiosity, but really kindness, good vibes, generosity, uh, good humor in particular, is overwhelming. It's really overwhelming from the far south all the way to the far north and all the way across.
Let me tell you one particular story. Unfortunately, you can't just fill your water bottle from a tap, right? That's not going to work for obvious reasons. So you are forced to buy bottles of water as you go along. And actually, we found when we went into small towns to fill up with water, and you're paying maybe 20 rupees for a bottle of water. So let's assume that you're buying 4 bottles of water. That's 80 rupees, and you hand over 100. And you say, "Keep the change, mate." The response was, "No, here's your 20 rupees back." And say, you can have it. Treat your kids to a lolly or something, and they say, "No, give it to somebody who needs it."
Right, right. That's so often in India and so often in the developing world. You have that so often. Here's your tip or whatever, and they're like, "What? No, that's yours." And they'll go, because so often in the developing world, when you try to pay for something with 100 and it costs 80, they don't have change anyway, right? And so they will go out of their way to go around the street to find 20 rupees from another shop and bring it back to give to you. And that says it all. Like that really says so much. But again, like incredible, deepest respect for taking a tuk-tuk. By the way, for those who don't know what a tuk-tuk is, it's a three-wheeled auto rickshaw vehicle, open on both sides, with a very small engine and a very noisy horn that you see all across Asia in particular, but also in Latin America and elsewhere. And I've been in a lot of tuk-tuks in my life. I mean, probably thousands. And there's no way you're going to get me driving all the way across India in one of those things. I have had some horrible, harrowing, very dangerous tuk-tuk rides, but I always made it through. But really, like deepest respect for going all the way from Kerala in the south, all the way up to the north on back roads and main roads and city roads and everything else. And that's surely to be an experience that stays with you forever. How did it affect any point of view you have on the idea of world citizenship and the ability of the human race to live together as one civilization and one polity?
Yeah, I think in India, I'm probably going to tell the tale of regional rural areas versus city areas, and I think the same is true in other places of the world as it is in India. And I also think that divide also probably comes around the wealth of people, right? So there is, and if you look at indigenous races around the world, they don't have a concept of land ownership. They have a concept where they are put on earth to look after the land and then make it as good or better for the next generation. And so there's obviously a sort of a property rights system that's your area, Scott, not mine, in terms of how that all works. But I think that where you're in the regional rural areas and you see people able to build communities and share and look after each other, I think that is where we need to get things back to. I think it's increasingly hard for people to get their head around it, particularly in city areas. I mean, I think we're talking about the Australian psyche. If gambling is part of it, the other one is home ownership, and property ownership, right? And that is a huge entrenched psyche. You're almost born with the upbringing to say you must own your own property and all this sort of stuff. And I think that if we're going to get to a place where we all live together without borders. I think this same thing transcends not only from individual property but country ownership and all this sort of stuff. And that's obviously a very complex situation, and we've got people breaking borders now, wanting to have parts of other people's lands and all this sort of stuff. How would it work? I think again that's a brainstorm. I'm sure you are brainstorming it. You're talking to a lot of people about it. I think that like all change, it's got to start with how people think and how people view these things. And I think this is where we can look to Indigenous groups to understand their perspectives on how this works. You have farmers who have used the land right into the rivers, and they've violated that important part around a river. Indigenous groups don't do that. The river is sacred. They'll look after the river. So those sort of concepts, however they can get weaved into the whole thing. I think once people have a love for nature, have a love for land, have enjoy the birds singing in the trees, and they really understand that. I think that it changes them. Again, it comes back to the metro regional people who live in regions and rural areas. They get that as part of their daily life. People who live in big cities don't get that. They actually don't know what they're missing out on, in a sense that they don't know what it could look like. I think we're lucky in Australia. We live in beautiful cities with big park areas, and you do get a sense of that. But you travel to other places like in India, and some of these bigger cities, and let's assume that you're in a family that's fifth, sixth, seventh generation living in the city. You probably don't have that mindset to be able to understand that. And it does become a bit, what's my property versus what's the next person's property. And that transcends into that mentality. Big topic, Scott. I don't know if we can crunch this one out in 5 minutes.
Well, no, it's about the biggest topic of all in the end. But one point or two to make is when people would have originally envisaged that there would ever be an India, for instance, as a nation state, they would have initially said, there's no possible way. We have 1,000 languages. We have whatever, 10,000 different ethnic and tribal groups. There's no way we can possibly coalesce together into a single political entity. And yet somehow it happened. And you could apply the same thinking to China, to all sorts of places in the world, even Germany, where you have many different subcultures that somehow coalesced together. And in effect, that's all we're going to do in the end once we finally merge together. We're going to have just more of them merging together and respecting each other. And I think that's why, your trip to India and all across the world, my trips across the world, if they've, and everyone else's, hopefully, if they've taught us anything, it is that you can change your worldview vis-a-vis other people. And that's almost always going to occur on the basis of personal interactions with those people who you laugh with and who you joke with and who you suddenly realize, oh man, if I was brought up in this village, I would have been that guy's best friend for sure. And you only see them for 5 minutes, you know, in your entire life, but in those 5 minutes, that guy could have been your best friend, and you can have that experience over and over again all across the world. And as more of us do that, I think it will become second nature to more and more people that we have to go forward in this manner. And if we don't, it's going to be nothing less than a Hobbesian war of all against all, as we compete for fewer and fewer resources and protect ourselves behind higher and higher walls. And that's certainly not a future I want to see. I don't want there to be city-state enclaves run by billionaires with 95% of humanity living outside the walls, suffering in unimaginable ways just so that those 5% can have a relatively luxurious life. That's not the planet I want to have. We have to all wake up and, not see ourselves as bound inextricably to the nation state with which we identify, but to the planet on which we all depend. And it may sound radical and lefty and loony and weird to a lot of people to say that, But exactly as you said, when an astronaut who might be super conservative, super pro America, rah rah, goes into space and looks down and sees that incredible, fragile blue marble floating in space and goes, "What the hell have I been doing all my life pretending that this one country, 5% of humanity, is somehow the greatest and the best that's ever existed?" It's not. What's the best and the greatest that's ever existed is this little planet in the distant corner of 2 trillion galaxies in the universe that we know about, the only one with life on it, and we're going to run it like the way we're running it now? I mean, how can we possibly do that? Total us versus them, total top versus bottom, total black versus white. I mean, it's insane. It's really, really kind of a collective insane position. And if there's this great American TV show from the 1950s called Twilight Zone, which is a sci-fi show that was on TV, and there was one episode that constantly comes to my mind where there were basically aliens, from somewhere else in the universe, and they found Earth and they hovered their spaceship above Earth, and they had the power, I think, to turn off electricity or something like that, and they did it just to see how this weird race of humans would respond. And the kind of punchline of the whole thing was, the smallest little thing turned them into absolute animals, and look at the paradise they were given and look what they've done with it, because that is the bottom line. We were given a paradise essentially, and look what we're doing with it. Yes, we've done so many great things and made so much progress, made life so much more comfortable for so many people, whether it's air conditioning or cars or planes or computers, but there's also a cost to be paid. And I think as more people hear stories from around the world, visit places around the world, hopefully that idea of world citizenship will like slowly seep in, and it won't become the impossible dream that it is so often seen to be now. And we can suddenly start no longer fearing the other because there really is no other, right? And I think fear is a huge reason why we're not able to reach that endpoint. But do you have any final thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, I think I'll leave you with one or two final points. I think the the saying "go and travel in someone else's shoes" is a good one. I think that, and your concept of fear, right? It might seem very scary to jump in a tuk tuk and drive from one end of the country to the other, and I get it. It's not for everyone. It was less scary than I thought it was. Sure, there were some hairy moments with some big buses and other things around, but it actually was all fine. I think that this concept of actually immersing yourself in another environment with another culture, with another people, is super important, right? I think you can watch television and documentaries and do it from your living room. You're not really going to fully understand it until you're in it. I think the closer you can get into that environment, I think the tuk tuk is quite a nice sort of analogy for that. We weren't in the transfer bus with the aircon. We were in the tuk tuk. We were on the street. We could smell it. We felt the heat. We felt the love coming from the people. And I don't think that anyone in the transfer bus is getting that same experience. I mean, I think so for practical reasons, some people need to take the transfer bus for whatever reason. But I think the closer you can get to the ground, the closer you can get to the people, the more you can actually socialize and take the time to do that.
Absolutely. The great American integral philosopher Ken Wilber always says this phrase, which is exactly relevant to that: the map is not the territory. And people don't realize that. They think that the map, looking at the map on the wall, is the same thing as actually being there. But you got to be there, at least in some way, somehow, in your own, within the realm of your own possibilities. And just, as a final point, a point that we often make here is that most people, most places, most of the time are incredibly nice people, no matter where you are in the world. And the overwhelming human sentiment of our species is kindness, cooperation, generosity, and acceptance. That is the norm. When you walk down the street, not everybody's trying to beat you up. At the very least, they're just trying to avoid you, and that's neutral. But more often than not, they'll give you a smile or they'll say hello or whatever. What percentage of all those millions of human interactions that you had in India over those 5 weeks, because it probably would have been millions in the end. It's a lot, whatever the number is. How many of them were truly bad vibing, truly horrible, truly scary, compared to the ones that were just fine?
I can't think of a single person who I met that was sort of particularly negative or anything else. I mean, sure, there's some neutral kind of blank faces, but in some cases they were just like, "What the heck? You know, who is this person? What are you doing in the Tuk Tuk?" It was overwhelmingly, a good vibe. I do remember the live and love concept coming from one particular person. Just do that and you're going to be fine. Now, I would also say probably this is the last thought is that put a smile on your face. It's irresistible. If you meet someone and it's a bit weird, just pause. 3 seconds will do it. Big smile, change everything.
And if you talk about sex, it makes it even better.
Yeah, I'm not going to recommend that. That'll be the leggy advice. Yeah.
I will totally recommend that. I have been in so many experiences across the world where there's like tension in the air, or there's like misunderstanding, and any like even slight sexual reference, it could, just whatever it is, but in a nice, decent way, always breaks the ice in even the most like totally religious conservative environment. You can do it and immediately everybody laughs. So that's one method. There's so many, but again, excellent to get the on the ground perspective that he couldn't even think of one person that was actually a jerk. That's pretty amazing. And I think people, when mutual respect is part of the equation and seeing yourself in the eyes of others, standing in their shoes, as you said, it's very difficult to become a jerk, and they won't become a jerk back at you. It's very, very few people that are responsible for all the, dickheadedness in the world. It's a tiny minority. They may have power. They may have pathological drives that enable them to reach the pinnacle of political or economic power, but they're not the majority. And the majority are good, kind-hearted, very decent people. And I think on that basis, we can hope realistically for a world grounded in shared citizenship between all of us. We don't know the time frame of this. We don't know the precise form it will take, but at least the sentiment is out there. And hopefully, through experiences like yours, Chris, and others, it will just bring us, that much closer to achieving the world that will be of benefit to all of us, which is a truly democratic world in which all of us participate on a regular basis as equals among equals. No country better than any other, no person better than any other.
And I think, Scott, it starts at the individual level, and if I'll just leave that last thought once more, live and love, and we'll probably get there.
Live and love will take us a long way to the end destination, that's for sure. So, Chris Blyth, thank you so much for being here today on Democracy Tomorrow for a truly inspiring and insightful talk. Everybody who's watching, please leave comments if you'd like below. Please subscribe to the channel, tell your friends, push like, and so on and so forth. And with that, we'll be able to continue onwards into the future. We'll see you again tomorrow with the next episode of this channel. For the moment, see you soon.